This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to books and research about a broad range of issues pertaining to Israel and beyond. This interview was made possible by the Z3 project, an initiative of the Oshman family JCC, committed to creating an ongoing dynamic forum for opinions and ideas about diaspora Jewry in Israel. The Oshman family's JCC is a premier source in the Silicon Valley of exciting and innovative programming focused on architecting the Jewish future. For more information about Z3, visit z3project.org. I am Gilad Halpern, and my guest today is a research fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute and an ordained rabbi who has recently submitted her PhD dissertation to the Tel Aviv University's School of Jewish Studies and Archaeology. Its title is Dialogues Between Jews and Gentiles in Rabbinic Literature. Rabbi and soon-to-be Dr. Sigalit Ur, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you. Good morning. It's great to be here.
So, can you start by laying out the historical context for us? What was the nature of the interaction between Jews and non-Jews at the time that gave rise to the genre of texts that you analyze in your work?
So it sounds like a simple question, but it's actually quite complicated because the stories that I collected and later analyzed were actually written in texts that range from the 2nd century all the way up to the 6th. But the stories they relate are mostly telling about events that happened before that, so during the 1st, maybe 2nd century. So when we think about the historical context, the question is, are we thinking about what really happened, the historical context in the 1st and 2nd century CE, meaning Roman Empire, ruling Eretz Israel, beginnings of Christianity, not really clear whether it's a separate organism from Judaism or it's still a sect in Judaism and so on, or whether these stories should be read not as pertaining to the historical context, but as of the events that they purport to tell about, but actually to the context in which they are written, which means not 1st and 2nd century Eretz Israel, but rather 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th century Bavel or Eretz Israel.
And is the perception of the non-Jew by those rabbis, did it evolve over time?
It probably evolved. It's very difficult to find that out, to tease that out from these texts. One should remember that it's very difficult to know exactly when a specific piece of a text was actually formed. Even if you look at the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, which we used to say was redacted end of the 5th, beginning of the 6th century. Nowadays, scholars really say that it was a long process of formation. And so when you look at a specific story, it's not really clear whether that story has historical roots in this 1st century that have somehow come orally through the centuries, whether it crystallized quite early or rather late. And so when you look at a story, even if you know that it was written in text from the 6th century, it's not really clear when it was formed. So it's really difficult to try and tease out an evolution of...
Yeah, but there's probably something that you know, or that researchers know, or even the reader, about the way that the non-Jew was perceived by them as, a conceptual entity, you can say.
Yes,
not necessarily an individual.
Again, I think we really would like to be able to answer that question, what does the Talmud think about the non-Jew? And I would really love to be able to say X or non-X, but I really can't. Because, and you really can't say that about any question about the Talmud. The Talmud is not a book, it's an anthology with many voices and many different attitudes. So I'm sorry, but I can't answer that.
That's absolutely fine. So the interesting thing, I think, about the texts that you analyze, and I think there are hundreds of them,
more than 300 stories, yes,
is that the majority of them were a lot less polemical than one would expect.
Yes, I must say when I approached the project, wanting to write about dialogues between Jews and Gentiles, my perception was rather colored by the sub-project that I started with. I did my master's thesis about 15 years ago on starting out to do one dialogue between Jews and Gentiles, but realizing that it was a way too big a project to do a PhD on. So decided to pick, rather at random, I must confess, a relationship between two people, Rabbi Yoshua ben Hanania and Kesar. We have a few, maybe 15 stories about them in the Babylonian Talmud. And I studied these stories for a master's thesis and came out rather disconcerted. They were very violent. They were very polemical. They ended with, in some cases, serious bodily harm to Kesar, to the emperor. And I must say I was sad, but I wasn't surprised, because one can understand this. These are stories written by Jews who were subjugated by the Roman or the Parthian Empire. They're written in a context of rabbinic literature, which in general is concerned with halakha, which is really a borderline between Jews and Gentiles. Jews are subject to halakha and Gentiles are not. And the wider context, of course, is from biblical times, this suspicion of Gentiles as being idolaters and potential threat to Jews, perhaps leading them astray. And another thing is that the Talmud is, or rabbinic literature in general, is a text that is written in Hebrew and Aramaic. So it's a text that is opaque to the oppressors, to the Gentiles. So basically, the Jews could write whatever they wanted. They could write these incredible fantasies about violence they would do to the Gentiles if they wanted to. They could write serious polemics against the Gentiles. And why not, really? I mean, if you want to sort of prop up the morale of these subjugated peoples, maybe it would be fun to write something that they would read and say, oh yeah, we socked them. You know, we can't sock them in reality, but at least we can tell ourselves wonderful stories about socking them. And that's really what I was expecting to find in my collection. And to my surprise, although, of course, there are stories like that, as I said, there are many voices in the Talmud, the predominant story is not of that nature. The predominant story, the predominant voice in these dialogues, in these conversations, is really not polemical. It's a really human, normal conversation between two people who have a lot of common interests, whether they be intellectual, philosophical, theological, political, or just normal life. And you know, even though they're on the two sides of this barrier, it turns out that this barrier isn't as high as I was expecting it to be.
So it's not propaganda per se, far from it.
Well, it depends what you mean by propaganda. I mean, as I was hinting at previously, if we don't see these stories as history, and I don't see them as history because, as I said, they're written many centuries after the fact, and in the Babylonian Talmud stories case, they're written also very geographically far away from the place of the events. One should suspect that they are not historical narratives, but rather literature. And in that case, one should read them not as a historical report of what actually happened in the 1st and 2nd century in Eretz Israel, but rather as one possibility, how we, the rabbis of the 5th, say, century, regard the proper relationship between Jews and Gentiles, or, and that's perhaps even more interesting, how we, the rabbis of the 5th or 6th century, would like to shape the perception of our readers as to what the proper regard of Jews towards Gentiles is. And so you might say that it's propaganda that is aimed at normalizing the relationship. If you wanted to shape a polemical relationship, you would tell many more violent stories like those I was studying in my master's thesis. But apparently you don't. Apparently what you're trying to normalize is a normal relationship.
Because it's literature and not historical account, do you think the dialogues were just a literary technique?
I assume that there is some nucleus of historical truth to these stories. Now, what do I mean by that? I don't necessarily mean that Rabbi Yoshua ben Hanania spoke to the emperor of Rome. That sounds a bit far-fetched, although perhaps, who knows? I mean, the emperor at the time of Rabbi Yoshua ben Hanania was Hadrian. Hadrian is known in Jewish literature to be the oppressor of the Bar Kokhba revolt. So sometimes, especially in the literature of the land of Israel, they append a wish for his bones to rot to his name. But on the other hand, in general literature, he's known as the philosopher emperor. He was really interested in philosophy and theology, and we know that he tried to learn about the cultures of surrounding peoples. And so, perhaps it's not so far-fetched. But the fact that Jews and Gentiles met in the streets of Eretz Israel and sometimes also in the streets of Rome. I mean, we know of delegations of Jewish rabbis who traveled by ship from the land of Israel to Rome to meet people in the courts. So it's not far-fetched that meetings like this took place. Now, what they exactly talked about, what the atmosphere was, who the audience was, who was the initiator of the conversations and who said the final word, that probably is not actual historical fact as reported in the Talmud. It's interesting, for example, that if you look at the subgenre of the conversations that I'm studying, that is the more than 100 stories in which an important Roman approaches an important rabbi and asks him a question. In these hundreds or so stories, it's always the Roman or the non-Jew who asks the question. And it's always the rabbi who says the last word. That can't be chance. That's got to be a literary mechanism trying to say something.
Do you think it's effective, more effective than other literary techniques? As someone who makes a living out of asking questions, I'm fishing for a compliment here.
Oh, yes, I can see how you could identify with that.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, when you show a Roman asking a question, and I should also mention that many times these questions by the Roman emperor or bishop or general and so on also quote a biblical verse and ask a question about it, which is amazing if you think about it. Why would an emperor know enough about the Hebrew Bible to quote a verse and ask about it? That obviously sounds like a bit of creative license. But when the writers of the stories tell us the story, they're showing these important Romans as people who are actually not so far away from our world of the Bet Midrash, of the study hall. And in fact, when you look at the questions themselves, you see that several of the questions that the Romans ask are also questions that are asked by the rabbis themselves in different contexts. And so it's not that the Romans are asking a question to tease or to confront or to provoke. They're asking questions, it seems, by reading the stories, they're asking questions out of an honest wish to understand, to learn, to know. And once you pull these Romans into the Beit Midrash, into the house of study, you make them a part of the world of Torah. You make them a part of the world that is really the most important place since the temple was destroyed. You know, when the temple was destroyed, the basic ritual of Judaism transformed from sacrifice to study of Torah. And the most important place was now not the temple, but the house of study. And the most important cultural hero was not the Kohen, the priest, but was now the Talmid Chacham. And really, what they're doing with these stories is transforming some of these Romans into Talmidei Chachamim, in a limited sense. As I said, the rabbis also always say the last word. The rabbis always know the answer. The rabbis use many different kinds of creative pedagogical methods in order to explain and sway and convince the Roman of their opinion. But still, I think it's rather incredible to think of what these stories are portraying.
What was really the purpose of engaging with non-Jews so seriously? Because it's not proselytizing, obviously. They're not there to convert them to Judaism. So what really is the point of all this?
Well, one has to remember that in these periods, and all these periods, and of course to this day, we're sitting here in Palo Alto in a Jewish community, in a Jewish community center that is huge and impressive, but we're surrounded by Jews who live surrounded by Gentiles, by non-Jews. And this was the experience of the people who wrote these stories. And so they are trying to reflect upon their day-to-day experiences. Now, I'm not suggesting that the people who wrote the stories met Roman emperors on a daily basis. Many of them lived, as we said, in Babylonia. Many of them lived at the time when the Roman Empire was no longer, but had been replaced by the Byzantine Empire. But I suggest they're trying to reflect upon their relationship in their times with the Gentiles surrounding them, ruling over them, by telling these stories. It's a funny way to do that, but it's a way that the Talmud does.
Some of these stories appear several times, several iterations. Can you give us an example of two of that and how it shed light on your research and the subject of your inquiry?
So one example that really comes to my mind is an example of a story that actually appears first in a more ancient text in the Tosefta, which was written in the 2nd, 3rd century in the land of Israel. And it's a strange story. It tells about a fire that broke out near the house of a Jew who lives near Tzipori in the Galilee. And I'm especially fond of this story because I live in the Galilee too, in a small village, and I've actually been to the place where the fire broke out, more or less, to the archaeological finds in the same village. And what happens is that the Roman soldiers of the garrison in the neighboring town see the fire, and they rush over to put it out. Apparently, at that time, it was part of the task of Roman soldiers to be the fire brigade also. The problem is that the fire broke out on Shabbat. And the story is told following a law that actually says, a halakha that says, one must not tell or ask a Gentile to put out the fire if it breaks out on Shabbat. But these Roman soldiers come unasked, and the Jew could just let them put out the fire, but he doesn't. He tells them not to. But after Motzei Shabbat, he sends them some money. We don't exactly know why, whether he wants to be on their good side or he wants to encourage them to come put out fires for other Jews because he's just being extra observant, but it's actually allowed for them to put out the fires, or, there could be other reasons. So it's a rather cryptic story in the context in which it appears, but it's quoted again twice in both the Talmudim, both in the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. And you can see when it's quoted that both Talmuds are looking at this story and scratching their heads and thinking, this story really is weird because it's following this halakha and it's really contradicting this halakha. It's not really clear why he told them not to put out the fire. It's not really clear why he paid them. So both Talmudim insert a little line here and a few words there into the original story in order to transform it into something that they need in order to block a specific hole in a halachic argument that they're making. And so what comes out of this process is this story that appears several times in texts, both in the land of Israel and in Babylonia, both in ancient times and in later times. And each time it's used halachically in a different way. But bottom line, it really shows this picture of these Roman soldiers of whom we know several rather scary stories about how they, persecute and they molest and they put to death and so on. But here they're actually quite helpful. They're putting out a fire that broke out in the home of a Jew.
Can you take us through the different subcategories of the dialogues? You divided them into 4 kinds, what they are and why this, how does this shape up into one coherent argument?
Well, I actually started out interested in this one category that I've described, which is the what I call the summit meetings, the conversations between important Romans or important Gentiles and important rabbis. But then I found out that there are actually many more genres of conversations between Jews and Gentiles. I decided to collect all the places where you find a Jew speaking to a Gentile about anything. And once I'd created this large collection, tried to categorize them. Many different categorizations could have been suggested. In fact, I always say I originally came from the field of computer science, so I am really used to classification systems, and I expect my data to march in straight lines and put itself into nice, neat cubbyholes, and I was dismayed to discover that the Talmud does not work this way. It's very difficult to try and categorize in one way, and I state in advance that I'm offering one categorization, but there could be many, and I set out to categorize, but also to choose a few categories that I found to be particularly interesting, and to study them. So one, as I said, I've already described, that's the summit meetings. Another category is the category of Kiddush Hashem. We have many memorable stories about Romans putting Jews to death, And before doing so, having a short conversation between, the soldier or the emperor and so on, and the person he's putting to death.
So it's essentially a martyr story.
Yes, it's a martyr story. I said there are many of these stories, and I should qualify that that's sort of something that people immediately come up with. When you ask people about conversations between Jews and Gentiles, those are some of the most prominent stories that come to mind, because they're so bloody, because they connect with our historical memory of cases in which this really happened. These are the conversations that people are reminded of when they think about this genre. But actually, it's rather surprising to find out that there aren't that many. Perhaps less than 20, I think, in the whole of ancient rabbinic literature. So that's the second category. I thought it was interesting to look at that category because, as I said, it's so very prominent in our historical memory. But I found that there was something odd that was going on there. Because I think one of the prime objectives of martyrdom, when you think about it, is the effect that it has on the observer who is not of the faith. When you say Kiddush Hashem, which literally means sanctifying God's name means that the non-Jewish observer looks at this martyrdom and says, wow, this God must be something if this man is willing to die for him. And so one would expect to find such exclamations in such stories. But the interesting thing is that one does not. One never hears a Roman or any other non-Jewish spectator looking at a martyrdom case and saying, wow. And what's interesting is that there's a different genre of stories in which you do find this wow, but you find the wow when the Jew treats the Gentile in an honest, respectful, and equal manner. And so perhaps what this genre is suggesting is that if you want to impress the sanctification of God's name on a Gentile, perhaps the correct method to do that is not using heroic methods, but just being a mensch. So that's the second category, the martyrdom stories. The third category was one that I found interesting because it's the stories that are brought in the context of halachic discussions in rabbinic literature. And one would expect, I think, in advance, that such stories would be ones where you would find the barriers the highest. As I said, halakha is the place where there's this obvious barrier between Jews and Gentiles. So I decided to examine these stories and found, again, to my surprise, that there are various literary techniques that the rabbis use when telling these stories that actually lower the barriers, that soften the edges of some of the halachot that discriminate between Jews and Gentiles. There's a nice example or two. One is, for example, a story about kashrut. It's a story about a Persian king who invites two Jews for a meal. That's mind-boggling in itself, just two Jews and a king sitting, having a little snack. And the snack is a citrus fruit, and the king wants to slice some citrus fruits and give them out to his guests. So he takes a knife, he slices a slice for himself and eats it. He slices a slice for one of the Jews and gives it to him. And then before he slices the third slice and gives it to the second Jew, he wants to kasher the knife. So he sticks it in the ground several times. This is just the halachic conversation that took place right before this story is brought in the Talmud. And he kashers the knife and he slices off a piece of the fruit and gives it to the second Jew. And the first Jew says, hey, what about me? If you know enough halakha in order to kasher a knife for this second Jew, why not for me? And the king says to him, well, we all know what you did last night. Suggesting that, perhaps you're not so observant a Jew. So if you did that last night, then this is what you're thinking about, the kashrut of the knife. If you think about this story, it's amazing because you find this shared meal, you find this Persian king knowing halakha and applying it in a discriminatory way so as to discriminate between more and less observant Jews. Again, I don't think this is history in any way, but the way it portrays the Gentile as knowing halakha, as applying halakha, is quite interesting. A second example in that genre is something that you see often in the Talmud, but in this case it's applied to this case of relations between Jews and Gentiles. There's a halakha in the Talmud that says that while one should not rob a Gentile, one must not do so, one is allowed to benefit from a mistake that the Gentile makes. So if one were to bring a modern example, and I don't recommend doing this at home, if you go and buy to a grocery shop and buy something and the seller is a Gentile and he gives you some extra change, then you're not required to return the extra change to him. So the halakha, the law, is stated in the Talmud and then is immediately followed by 4 stories that tell of cases in which quite respectable Babylonian rabbis take advantage of this, take advantage of mistakes by Gentiles, and really benefit from them. And the stories increasingly get more and more critical of the rabbi's behavior, suggesting, I think, that the law is the law, but when you put that law in practice, and these stories are telling about the practice of these Babylonian rabbis, this may lead to, questionable practices. So, in typical fashion, the Talmud is undermining its own laws by the narrative that it narrates. In this case, trying perhaps to suggest that this law that allows benefiting from the mistake of a Gentile, that discriminates between Jews and Gentiles, is perhaps not so savory and should not be applied in practice. So that was the third category, the halachic stories. And the fourth, and one I must admit that I most enjoyed, is a category that is all about a specific character. That character is called Taya. We're not exactly sure what he is, but the way he comes out in the stories is sort of like a Bedouin type, a nomadic desert wanderer, tracker who knows all kinds of things and who pops up at the right minute to insert the little piece of information that the rabbis are looking for right at the right time and place. And he's really a character, this Taya, and he pokes fun gently at the whole rabbinic culture, at the fact that Babylonian rabbis are very honor conscious, at the fact that they are so swept up into the halachic minutiae that they ignore the big picture, at the fact that they actually often find themselves not knowing enough Hebrew in order to understand the biblical verses that they're trying to interpret, and so have to go seeking out the interpretation of the words themselves. And I fell in love with this Taya figure, and I think that's the chapter that I like the best. So 4 subcategories: summit meetings, halachic stories, martyrdom stories, and the stories of the Taya.
How do you think these stories or the overall perception of the Gentile affected future perceptions or later perceptions of the Gentile in Jewish theology and culture? So
that really goes back to the reason why I chose thesis topic, really. I chose this thesis topic when I transitioned from computer science to Jewish education. And at the time I was working for an NGO that was doing Tikkun Olam in the Galilee. And as part of that, I participated in 2 projects that sort of fed into each other, although they were very different. One was I was facilitating dialogue between Arab Israeli kids and American Jewish kids who came to Israel on short-term programs. We would get these kids into a room, split them up into mixed circles, toss out a few suggestions for topics to discuss, and let them have at it. And so there I was, standing in a room full of Jews and Gentiles, having a dialogue. And this was 2002, the midst of the Second Intifada, as buses were exploding on the streets and thousands of people were killed on both sides. And it was interesting to see the dynamics of this kind of dialogue. On the other hand, another project that I was involved in was guiding educational tours in Tzipori, in the Galilee. And the main hero of Tzipori of that time, the time we were focusing on, the time of the Mishnah, is Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, Rabbi Judah the Prince. And one of the things he's famous for, and some of the stories that I was telling when we were touring Tzipori, his conversations with Antoninus, with the emperor of Rome at his time. And they were very friendly, incredibly friendly. In fact, they were the complete opposite of those stories that I studied in my master's thesis. They're friends. They give each other advice. This is the one case in which It's not always rabbi teaches Roman, but sometimes it's Roman teaches rabbi. And so the juxtaposition of these two types of dialogues, the real-life dialogues in the Rumah between Arabs and Jews, and the dialogues between Rabbi Judah the Prince and Antoninus, struck me, and I wanted to study these Talmudic stories more. The reason I wanted to study these stories more is that I think stories in general are something that we tell our kids, and they imbibe them before they've developed their critical faculties, and so they get to their guts, not through their heads, but straight into their guts. So it's sort of become a part of our DNA, of our unconscious, our national unconscious, as it were. There was one time I was sitting in the National Library in Israel, a bit bored, and so I decided to try a little experiment. I ordered from the bowels of the earth, that's the way the National Library is organized, I ordered a series of books called Ko Asu Chachamenu. It's a series of books that a kindergarten teacher wrote, adapting rabbinic literature stories for kindergarten kids. And I decided to go through these stories and see how many of them were describing dialogues between Jews and Gentiles. And I found that a full quarter of the stories were about that. So apparently our kids are hearing lots of these stories, and I thought it's really important to see what there is to see. Notwithstanding that, I think the perception is really unfair to the picture that I've tried to show, in that I think it's natural that we tend to give more attention to the bloody stories, to the stories that make us feel extreme emotion, like fear or hatred. We tend to give more attention to stories that connect to historical experience, and sometimes we even tend to read stories through the lens of different historical periods, and thereby change their focus. And so I think perhaps we should be going back to these kindergarten books and rewriting them to show the Gentiles in a more lenient light.
Well, there's your next project. Rabbi and soon-to-be Dr. Sigalit Ur, good luck with the dissertation, and thank you very much for joining us today to talk about dialogues between Jews and Gentiles in rabbinic literature.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. And
also many thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, to Itai Shalom, our producer, as well as Amitai Freeman, the director of the Z3 project. And now we've got a little request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we have a special request for you. Please consider writing us a review. Just launch the app, select our podcast in the library section, scroll down to ratings and review, and press write a review, and then, of course, write one. You can support us by going to our website, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Every little helps. Check out our archive. It has more than 500 interviews. If you like what we do here, you can also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.